Hey everybody, I'm really glad you found Suncrest Messages. I do hope you'll take a minute to subscribe to either our podcast or our YouTube channel. And you can also download the Suncrest app. There's great stuff there that goes far beyond these messages. Either way, I hope that the next 30 minutes helps you integrate faith with your life. Enjoy. It is true that this is the 23rd straight year that I've done a Christmas teaching series. And here's the thing. Some years, I don't love it. It's like Christmas came again, right? But this year, over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to talk to you about a solution. It's a solution that's real for your life and our life, and it might actually be a solution you need to offer to somebody else. It's a solution for just about everything, but the thing is, it's unsettling. And I'm excited about this because I'm going to describe what I think is actually the central message of why Christmas happened. Why Jesus came into the world, into Bethlehem that night. And I want you to stick with me for all 3 weeks. Because really this series might seem more unsettling at the end of week 1 or the end of week 2, and you have to let me get to the whole thing. I hope that you'll make a point to be here all 3 weeks. Even if you're one of our guests for the dedications this weekend, please come back over the next couple of weeks. If you have to miss one, catch it online, because this all fits together. So let me just start with a personal observation. This might seem naive to you. I would absolutely own that. It's just my observation. This isn't the wisdom of Jesus. This is just the way Greg thinks about the world. Here's a thought that I have. I don't know why everybody wouldn't want Christianity to be true. I don't know why everybody wouldn't want Christianity to be true. Now, when I say that, I don't know exactly what you think, because for sure, different iterations, different incorrect versions of Christianity have been shared over the years, and it's possible that you grew up with a version of Christianity that you think, well, I don't even want that to be true. It's possible that you have a coworker who uses their version of Christianity to judge everyone around them, and you're like, this doesn't make any sense at all. But what I'm telling you is that in the original version of Christianity, in the Jesus version of Christianity, in the story of Christmas version of Christianity, if we could go back to that, I don't know why everyone wouldn't want this story to be true. It's an amazing, amazing story. Now, I understand that there's a difference between these two statements. That you could say, I don't believe it's true. And you could say, I don't want it to be true. And those are two totally different things. And if you've been around Suncrest very long, you know I have a high respect for people who would say, hey, I'm kind of interested in Christianity, or I'm willing to listen about it, but I don't believe it yet. I have all kinds of respect for those people who are on a journey, who would be open-minded about it. And there could be very good reasons why you don't believe Christianity is true. Maybe you still have some questions that you need answered. Maybe you had an experience in your life that remains unexplained. Maybe you're waiting for an experience in your life that would somehow confirm that this is real. There's lots of reasons that you may yet not believe Christianity is true. But I hope that by the time we're done, beginning tonight and over the next few weeks, you would be in a place where you'd think, it may not be true. I'm not sure I can get my head around it. I'm not sure I believe it all, but I would want that to be true. You see, there's an interesting observation that a very interesting guy made hundreds of years ago. His name was Blaise Pascal, and he was a mathematician. I mean, he was a rational thinking, facts, logic sort of person. In his generation, the greatest mathematician, the greatest philosopher even that there was. And this is one of his observations that he wrote about in talking about how people are persuaded. He said, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. And if you're a truth, rational thinking, logic sort of person, you might say, well, that's true, but it kind of actually shows the weakness of everything. People just chase what they like, they chase what's attractive, and then they try to come up with good reasons to justify why that might be true. And I think to some degree that's what Blaise Pascal is saying. But I also think he's saying something else. He's saying one of the beautiful things about beauty, about being attracted to something, is it can instigate something in you. If you would want something to be true, then you would actually go on a pursuit, and you still need to be honest, because it may or may not be true, but it could initiate a journey that says, you know what, I'll be serious about figuring out whether it's true or not. And that's really my invitation to all of you this Christmas. Now, for me, the Christmas story is about the arrival of grace. The whole Christmas story, the idea that Jesus would come into the world, that he would live among us, and I'll show you some instances from his life tonight, that he would die for us, that he would rise from the dead, it is entirely a story of grace. And grace actually stands in contrast to what people had understood in the old covenant before Jesus was here. And grace definitely stands in contrast to what most of us think about how the world is shaped and even should be shaped. And I want to help you understand just at the most basic level what grace is tonight. I'll never explain it all. I believe that grace is the most beautiful concept ever conceived in the mind of God. But what does it actually mean? Well, this is how most of us experience it. We are prone to crave grace when we're guilty, right? When you're guilty, especially when you're caught. You're caught red-handed. There is no explanation. You walk in, your parents have your stuff on the table. They found it in your room. There's no way out of this. And you sit down with them and you just think, I hope there's grace. If you're at work and your boss has caught you doing something wrong or actually, frankly, just failing on a project and you know what you deserve, but you sit across from your boss and you think, I don't have any excuses, but I just hope there's some grace in this. When we're the guilty party, everybody craves grace. On the flip side, we're prone to withhold grace when others are guilty. When you've been wronged by someone, the first instinct for most of us is not to extend them grace. Maybe even worse, when someone you love has been wronged or hurt by someone else, a justice thing wells up inside of all of us to give them what they deserve, but we're not prone, actually we're hesitant to extend grace. And so when you're on the receiving end, grace is beautiful. When you're asked to be on the giving end, it's hard to get our mind around. This is part of what's so unsettling about it. And in the simplest way to think about grace, we could just use 3 related words. Grace is God's favor on us in a way that's undeserved. It's unearned and even unearnable. But maybe most important, it's undeservable. You see, this is the wild thing about grace. The moment you try to start earning it, the moment that you decide you deserve it, is the moment that voids it all. This is one of the ways I've said it. We can't receive grace for what it is until we're convinced we don't deserve it. Have any of you ever tried to throw yourself a surprise party? You can't throw yourself a surprise party. The very notion of throwing yourself a surprise party voids the idea that it's a surprise party. And the very notion that you might think you deserve grace or that you could justify a reason for you to receive grace actually voids the option for you to experience grace. Because the moment that you shift into justification or earning or reasoning out why you should get it, you've missed it. Grace is undeserved and it is undeservable. So, when John, who was a follower of Jesus, John, who was an eyewitness of Jesus' whole life, John, who saw Jesus do his miracles, John, who started following Jesus out because he was attractive and he was fascinated by him and spent the rest of his life with Jesus figuring out whether this was really a true figure of God, John introduces the story of Christmas to us in a way that's different than the other writers that we have in the scriptures. Matthew and Mark and Luke, they all had done their homework to give us an accurate story of Jesus' life. But John, he doesn't start it with a story. He doesn't focus on the narrative of a manger and a star and all the things that we think of in the Christmas story. He starts with a concept. And this is the way that John describes Christmas night. He says, the Word became flesh. The Word became flesh. And you might be sitting there like, what does that even mean? And I think to some degree, John would be writing it down and scribbling it out, and he's like, I'm not even quite sure how to describe this, but here's what I'm trying to say. Most of the time, people use words to describe things. And people have been using words to try to describe God for centuries, for millennia at this stage. And John is saying, God didn't just give us words that are written down on a piece of paper. He gave us a living word. The logos is the Greek idea, that Jesus himself is the Word of God. He is the revelation of God. He's actually the best way to understand who God is. And he came to live with us. With us. How would you even write this down? It has to blow your mind even to describe it. In the beginning was the Word. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory. And I think he's trying to say, for anyone who would be skeptical, he's saying it's not just me, it's we. There were 12 of us. We followed him everywhere that he went. And there were crowds that went everywhere. They saw the miracles. They watched him die on the cross. He would say, there's evidence. There are hundreds and hundreds of people who met him after he died. We saw the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. Full, and then this is it, of grace and truth. That's the story of Christmas. That God would send his Son into the world full of grace and truth. Now, this is a very important concept because this is not grace and truth out of balance. Some of you grew up in homes where your parents were out of balance. They were either all grace or all truth. And most of you are in therapy now because you grew up with parents like that. Some of you grew up in churches that were all truth churches. And you've been wounded. You've been licking your wounds from that ever since you grew up. And some of you grew up in churches that were all grace. And then you think, do they even believe anything? Grace and truth, the fullness of grace and truth, is not grace and truth in an imbalance. But ironically, the fullness of grace and truth is also not grace and truth balanced with each other. It's not 50-50. It's not a little bit of both. The fullness of grace and truth is Jesus coming into the world to show us who God is and to say God is full of grace and full of truth. And if you start to watch the experiences that Jesus had when he grew up and he started to walk on the earth, you would find that he's all grace and all truth all the time. And it will get a little unsettling. You see, here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus never watered down the truth, and he never backed off the grace. You know what Jesus did? He called sin, sin. And he called sinners, sinners. And then he laid down his life for the sinners, even though he had no sin. It was all grace, all truth, all the time. And we see this continuously. I'm going to tell you 3 stories from Jesus' life. You've heard me tell these stories before. I'm going to tell the quick version, but I want you to see the moment of grace and truth. John was actually with Jesus on a day when this encounter happened. There was a guy named Levi. Levi was a horrible person, worst of sinners, just horrible. And when Jesus encountered Levi, he said, hey, I'd actually like to hang out with you. And when Jesus said to the most horrible person in town, the one who had betrayed his family and exploited everyone he knew, and Jesus said, I want to go to dinner with you. All of a sudden, the categories got messed up in everybody's head. This person who was nothing like Jesus was now going to be in an environment with Jesus. And not only that, but Jesus said, hey, get your friends together. I'd like for them to be at dinner too. I'm going to bring my friends to dinner. We'll all be there. Now, people try to picture this setting, and people picture it in different ways, but at least one of the pictures, you can stick with me on this, is it's like, this could be a very uncomfortable dinner. You got Levi, Matthew, with all of his sinner buddies, and you got Jesus with all of his followers, and it's like, what are you going to talk about? This is kind of how I picture it. Forgive me for this image. It's almost like you're at a party. Maybe it's your company party, maybe it's another party, and like it's a great party. People are enjoying themselves, maybe enjoying themselves a little too much. Maybe they had a little bit too much to drink. Maybe you've had a little bit too much to drink, and then I show up at the party. Wouldn't that be awesome? You're like, wah, wah, wah. And Jenny and I are just there hanging out at the party, and all the whispers around are like, how long are they going to stay? And then as soon as we say, it's like, party's back on again. But this is the moment where it's uncomfortable. And it's not just uncomfortable because it's this group of horrible people with the people who are followers of Jesus, but there's a third group that calls in. This is a group called Pharisees. They're religious leaders, and they are truthers. Right? They're all about the truth, and they have this category in their mind to say, if you're like doing something wrong, I just need to avoid you. Like I don't touch you, I walk away, you're a sinner over there, I'll walk over here. That's the whole way that Pharisees structured their life. So they can't quite get this together in their head. And they actually say to Jesus and his followers, what's going on here? Why would a rabbi like Jesus hang out with these horrible sinners? And here's what Jesus said. He said, don't call Matthew and his friends sinners. That might hurt their feelings. Jesus didn't say that. I just put that up on the screen. Because that's not the kind of thing Jesus would say. Actually, this is what he said. He'd say, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now, interestingly, Jesus is probably sitting across the table from the guys he's calling sick. And they might be like, you're calling me sick? How offensive is that? You just called me sick. Just like, you know you're sick. That's the truth. He'd go on. He'd say, hey, Pharisees, go and learn what this means, which is actually, honestly, kind of a low-level burn to the Pharisees. The Pharisees who think they're smarter than everybody else. Jesus is like, well, how about you go learn something? Let me tell you the truth. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Not all your religious sacrificial rituals. That's what he's saying. And then he says, for I have not come to call the righteous. And then this is how I picture it. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Because Jesus would call sin, sin. And he would call sinners, sinners. And then he'd lay down his life for them. Isn't that wild? I mean, the categories do not fit together. The people who are sinners probably deserve rejection, and the people who are holy probably deserve Jesus, but it's the sinners who have Jesus, and it's the people who are holy who are getting some rejection. He's mixing up all the categories on us. There's another story in the Gospel of John. John records this one in John chapter 8. You've heard me tell this story. It's a woman who's caught in adultery. She's drug out into the temple court, the temple sitting right next door, and there's some religious leaders there who are holding the rocks that they want to use to stone her, to kill her, because the law says, it actually says this, that this is a stonable offense. And they say, hey, Jesus, what do you think? And Jesus calls their bluff. He says, oh, I guess that's what the law says. Go for it. But one thing. You should go for it if you're sinless. Let the one who's without sin, you throw the first one. And it's so fascinating because the scripture actually tells us that it's the older guys first who start to walk away, and it's almost like they grab the young ones by the collar and like, he got us again, and they walk away, and then it's just Jesus and the woman who had committed adultery. And in this moment, he looks at her and he says this, then neither do I condemn you. That's powerful. She was guilty, and she had not repented. Then he looks her in the eyes, and he says, go and sin no more. It's all of it. It's full-on grace. You are not condemned, and it is full-on truth. You're living your life in a train wreck. You got to change that. It's not right. And Jesus is going to say it all. And for a lot of people, these two categories don't go together. The people who are guilty go with the category of condemned. The people who are not guilty go with the category of not condemned. But Jesus says the guilty are not condemned. Is that unsettling? Is it disturbing? Is that enticing to you, or does it put you off? Well, it might very well depend on how you see yourself. And frankly, whether you think you deserve grace. So then, there's another occasion where John is sitting at the foot of the cross. At this stage, Jesus has already been nailed to the cross. I don't need to go into all the ugly details of crucifixion, but it's horrible. And the idea that every word, every sentence Jesus would speak, or the two guys who were hung beside him would speak, like it's just painful to even speak. One of the things Jesus says to John, who's sitting down right in front of him next to Mary, he says, John, take care of my mom. Take care of my mom. And then John watches a conversation unfold on the cross that is just an unbelievable conversation. It's a conversation that should bother us in certain ways. It's the conversation that puts the amazing in amazing grace. Because there are two criminals, one hanging on each side of Jesus, and one is mocking Jesus. He says, hey, if you are who you say you are, help us out. And the other criminal says a totally different posture. It says this, the other criminal rebuked the first one. Don't you fear God, he said. You can almost picture him having to lift himself up, the pain of feeling that the nails through your hands, just to say, since you're under the same sentence, we are punished justly. We are getting exactly what we deserve. But this man, he's done nothing wrong. And then in a moment, I don't know, of boldness or last gasp or whatever it is, the thief says this to Jesus. Jesus, will you remember me when you come into your kingdom? This is the prayer of a sinner asking God himself for a grace he knows he doesn't deserve. And if you have ever wondered, would God listen to, would God answer the prayers of a sinner? The answer to that is yes, because it's the only kind of prayers there are. He's asking for something that's kind of unbelievable. He doesn't have a leg to stand on with Jesus. He doesn't even have the ability to make a promise to make things right later on. He's just purely dependent on the grace of this man. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, here's the truth. Let me tell you the truth. Today, you will be with me in paradise. And I can tell you, every person, John, probably Mary, everyone who's sitting at the foot of that cross, the soldiers who saw what was going on, it's like, this doesn't make any sense at all. This does not make any sense at all. It's not right, is it? It's so unsettling. And here's the reason why it's so unsettling. It's because grace, like life, is not fair. Grace, like life, is not fair. It is not, I did this, so you'll do that. It is not, I'm going to get what I deserve. It is not, I'll pay you so you take care of me. It's not any of that. And this is why it's so powerful when someone extends grace to you. And it's why it's so terribly difficult to extend grace to someone who doesn't deserve it. People sometimes ask, it's a fair question, but Greg, what about justice? What about consequences for the things that have been done wrong? And I think Jesus would say, trust me, I understand justice and I understand consequences. Let's talk about justice. The justice of God would crush you. The justice of God would crush you. Don't take the posture that you're the flag flyer for justice, because the justice of God would crush all of us. And Jesus is saying, and instead of you, me. If someone thinks, I'll get into the kingdom, I'll go to heaven, I'll spend eternity with God because I deserve it, the justice of God will crush you. Jesus says that's great. That's why grace. Consequences? Let's talk about consequences. He says, we all know this. The consequences of our sinfulness, the results that come from the choices we make, those will crush us in this life. Every sin, every rebellion against God comes pre-packaged with a human consequence. Every sin kind of plays gotcha. But the contrast is Jesus says, this is Christmas. I came to get you. You see, this is blowing the mind of everybody who's sitting around in Jesus' time, and I think it's effective. It's still blowing our mind today. Because it's not the way we're prone to think, and it's actually not the way it's always been. One of the most fascinating things about Jesus is the contrast he draws the moment he comes into the world. Luke writes it like this in Luke 16. He says, the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Now, side note, not to confuse you, this isn't the John I was talking about earlier. This is John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who was a cousin of Jesus and came right before Jesus and said, I'm laying the way for Jesus. John and Jesus were only a few years apart. Like it's right there. Everything up until the moment John came, which is essentially the moment Jesus came, was built on the law and the prophets. And all of the law and the prophets was built on justice. It was built on you paying for what you deserve, you making the sacrifices to make up for what you've done. He said that's the way the old covenant worked. That's exactly the way the old covenant worked in the law and the prophets. But since that time, when the Word, the revelation of God, came into the world as a person, the good news of God is being preached. I don't know whether you believe Christianity or not. I don't know whether you think that it's true. But in the original version of Christianity, in the story of Jesus and what he's done and what people wrote about him and what people verified about him, in that story, this is good news. I think everybody should want it to be true. Because when Jesus comes into the world as an infant, grace comes into the world. And grace is the invitation that says to all of us, I know everything that you ever did. I know every sin that you ever committed. I know the consequences of your actions. I know what goes on in your mind. I know it all. That's the truth. And I still want you to be with me. I came to be with you. And I showed you all these stories so that you would know in your own life,
I want you to be with me. And you don't have to clean your life up first. That would be acting like you deserve it. You don't have to justify what you've done. The whole story of Christianity is, I'm not good enough. I have no hope. Thank God that grace has come. And then for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we get to live in that every day. And next week, I'm going to ask those of you who are followers of Jesus if the grace you have received is also being passed on to others this Christmas. Let's pray for that right now. God, in an odd way, God, I want to thank you for not backing off of the truth, for being honest and helping us to see us for who we are and who we aren't. And I thank you, God, for the power of sincerity and the ability to mix up our categories. And God, my prayer this Christmas season is there would be a fresh wind of grace pour over our church. That every one of us would encounter you in a way that's beautiful and lofty and not something we can always understand, but something that we know is what we need, is absolutely what we want. And so, God, I just pray that we're open to that. With our hands in the air, acknowledging it's your work, not ours. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Well, I really hope that was helpful for integrating faith with life. Listen, if you're in Northwest Indiana, I'd love to have you join us in person. Head over to suncrest.org and plan your visit.